Late April 1945, Central Germany. The war had already been decided, even if the guns had not yet fallen silent. Smoke still drifted over shattered towns. Roads were clogged with refugees, retreating soldiers, and abandoned equipment. In the middle of this collapse, a group of German women stood behind temporary wire fencing, their uniforms worn, their insignia still sewn in place. They were not screaming. They were not resisting. They were watching. Across the fence, American soldiers moved with a calm that felt unnatural after years of chaos. Clipboards passed from hand to hand. Names were written carefully. Instructions were given once, quietly, and followed. No shouting, no blows, no humiliation. For many of these women, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries attached to the collapsing German war machine, this moment was more unsettling than fear. They had been trained to expect brutality in defeat. They had been warned that capture meant disorder, revenge, and loss of all status. Instead, they encountered order. Barracks were organized. Food was issued on schedule. Medical checks followed written procedures. Even rank, stripped of power, was still recorded. The war they had known was ending not in violence, but in systems, and that realization carried a weight they were unprepared to face as the machinery of captivity began to close around them. The collapse of Germany and the arrival of American systems. By the spring of 1945, Germany no longer resembled a functioning state. The Third Reich was fragmenting at every level, military, administrative, and psychological. Allied forces were advancing from both west and east, compressing what remained of German-controlled territory into shrinking pockets of resistance. Cities lay in ruins. Communications had collapsed. Command structures existed mostly on paper. For the American Army, this phase of the war was not simply about combat. It was about management. The United States had spent years preparing not just to defeat enemy armies, but to control the aftermath of that defeat. Long before the first American soldiers crossed into Germany, the War Department had issued detailed plans for occupation, prisoner handling, and civil control. These plans were not improvised. They were rehearsed through manuals, training films, and field exercises that emphasized predictability over punishment. By March and April of 1945, U.S. forces were capturing German prisoners in numbers never before seen in the European theater. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. Alongside soldiers came civilians, party officials, and thousands of women who had served in auxiliary roles. Communication staff, clerical workers, medical personnel, and labor units attached to the German military infrastructure. These women had not been trained for defeat. They had been trained for obedience. Nazi ideology had conditioned them to believe that surrender was dishonor and that captivity would erase identity. Propaganda films, lectures, and internal briefings warned of Allied cruelty. Americans, in particular, were portrayed as chaotic, undisciplined, and vengeful, soldiers driven by impulse rather than control. Reality unfolded differently. American POW doctrine was built on a simple premise: control through order. Prisoners would be processed, categorized, documented, and assigned within systems that minimize improvisation. Emotion was considered a liability. Procedure was protection. Female prisoners presented a unique challenge. German women in uniform occupied a gray zone. Many were not combatants, yet they were part of the military structure. American regulations required them to be treated as prisoners of war if captured in a military role, regardless of gender. That meant barracks, roll calls, medical inspections, and records. Everything written down. Everything standardized. For German women who had spent years inside a system driven by ideology and fear, the absence of shouting was disorienting. Orders came through posted rules, not personal dominance. Guards followed schedules. Food appeared regularly. Discipline existed, but it was impersonal. This was not kindness. It was administration. And administration, when contrasted with the chaos of collapsing Reich, felt profoundly unfamiliar, setting the stage for a deeper psychological confrontation that would unfold inside the camps themselves. From ideological collapse to institutional control, as American units moved deeper into central and southern Germany, the volume and diversity of prisoners increased rapidly. By May 1945, the U.S. Army was responsible for hundreds of thousands of German captives across the European theater. Prisoner of war camps were established in former training grounds, airfields, factories, and repurposed barracks. Space is chosen not for symbolism, but for efficiency. Order was the priority. The American military approach to captivity was shaped by both doctrine and experience. Earlier campaigns in North Africa and Italy had taught U.S. commanders a critical lesson. Disorder among prisoners created risk. Hunger, uncertainty, and humiliation produced resistance. Structure reduced it. Every camp, regardless of size, followed a standardized framework. Intake, identification, medical screening, housing assignment work details, and routine inspections. For German female prisoners, this structure was shocking precisely because it lacked ideological messaging. There were no lectures, no attempts at re-education, no public displays of dominance. Instead, American guards enforced rules mechanically. Wake-up times were posted. Meals were issued on schedule. Infractions were noted, not punished theatrically. Authority flowed from the system itself, not from individual personalities. This contrasted sharply with the environment these women had known. In the Third Reich, authority was deeply personal. Power depended on proximity to the party, on visible loyalty, and on the ability to command fear. Discipline was emotional and performative. Punishment was designed to humiliate as much as to correct. Inside American camps, humiliation was inefficient. German women were assigned to barracks based on classification, not ideology. Former nurses were grouped with medical staff. Clerical workers were noted as such. Even rank, though stripped of command authority, was recorded for organizational purposes. Identity, while powerless, was not erased. This created tension. Many prisoners expected that order would eventually break, that guards would lose control, that retaliation would follow, that the rules were temporary. But days passed, then weeks. The routines held, the same procedures repeated with unyielding consistency. Even basic interactions reinforced this pattern. Guards did not argue. They pointed to regulations. Requests were processed through forms. Complaints were logged. Silence replaced shouting. Predictability replaced fear. For some prisoners, this order was interpreted as deception, a prelude to something worse. For others, it produced a slow, unsettling realization. The Americans were not improvising. They were executing a system that functioned regardless of who stood inside it. This realization marked a psychological shift. The collapse of Nazi authority had been sudden and violent. The arrival of American control was quiet, procedural, and absolute. There was no space to resist it emotionally, only to exist within it. And within that system, German female prisoners began to confront an uncomfortable truth. Captivity under American rule was governed not by revenge, but by rules that would shape every human interaction to come. Human shock, institutional discipline, and the enemy's perspective. The first angle was human, and it was visible almost immediately. German female prisoners arrived carrying exhaustion, fear, and deeply ingrained expectations. Many had lived for years inside a society where authority was loud, personal, and emotionally charged. Orders were shouted. Punishment was public. Compliance was enforced through humiliation. In that world, chaos and cruelty often existed side by side. American camps did not behave that way. The absence of visible cruelty was itself destabilizing. Women waited for insults that never came. They braced for violence that did not occur. Guards did not mock accents or uniforms. They did not tear away insignia with ceremony. They did not argue ideology. Instead, they checked lists, verified names, and moved on. For prisoners trained to interpret power through aggression, this calm felt unnatural. Some women responded by withdrawing entirely. They spoke only when questioned. Others watched closely, searching for inconsistencies. When none appeared, anxiety increased rather than decreased. A system that did not display emotion was harder to read, and therefore harder to anticipate. The second angle was discipline, American discipline. U.S. military order in POW camps was not improvisational. It was the product of years of planning. Field manuals governed nearly every aspect of captivity: food distribution, medical care, labor assignments, sanitation, and guard conduct. Deviation from procedure was discouraged because it created uncertainty. Uncertainty bred resistance. Guards were instructed not to debate prisoners, not to threaten them, not to humiliate them. Enforcement was meant to be impersonal. A rule applied to one prisoner applied to all. This approach had a subtle psychological effect. Authority became invisible but constant. There was no single figure to blame or appeal to. The system itself became the controlling force. The third angle was enemy perception. German women had been raised on propaganda depicting Americans as undisciplined, indulgent, and morally chaotic. They expected either brutality or indifference. What they encountered instead was a structure that functioned without visible passion. To many prisoners, this was more disturbing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty could be explained. It fit the narrative they had been given. Order without hatred did not. They began to notice details. Guards followed schedules precisely. Punishments were rare and mild. Food distribution was consistent. Medical treatment was routine. Even boredom was regulated. This forced a reassessment, not spoken aloud, but internal. If the enemy was capable of this level of control, what did that say about the war they had been told they were fighting? That question lingered in silence, shaping every observation that followed. And it opened the door to a deeper contradiction, one that extended beyond emotion into strategy, logistics, and power itself. Power through systems, psychological control, and quiet superiority. The fourth angle was strategic, and it revealed itself slowly. American order inside POW camps was not accidental compassion. It was control through predictability. By maintaining strict routines, U.S. authorities removed uncertainty, and with it, the emotional volatility that often fueled resistance. Prisoners who knew what would happen tomorrow were less likely to panic today. German female prisoners began to understand this intuitively. Roll calls occurred at the same hour. Meals arrived on schedule. Work details were posted in advance. Infractions were addressed calmly, usually with written warnings rather than confrontation. Authority did not escalate emotionally. It remained flat, procedural, and consistent. This consistency was disarming. In the German military system, authority had been personal. It depended on the temperament of officers, the mood of commanders, and the ideological fervor of the moment. In American camps, authority appeared institutional. It lived in paperwork, schedules, and posted regulations rather than in shouting voices. The fifth angle was psychological containment. American camp planners understood that prisoners stripped entirely of identity were unpredictable. Despair created instability. Instability required force. Force consumed manpower. Order reduced cost. Female prisoners were therefore treated as a distinct administrative category. Housing, labor assignments, and medical care reflected that classification, not out of sentiment, but efficiency. Separation reduced conflict. Clear roles reduced friction. German women noticed the separation immediately. They were not mixed randomly. They were not subjected to arbitrary labor. Tasks were mundane: cleaning, kitchen assistance, clerical sorting. Work was framed as routine, not punishment. This framing mattered. It allowed prisoners to preserve a sense of self, even within captivity. They were no longer soldiers. They were detainees. The distinction was subtle, but it altered behavior. Compliance increased. Resistance decreased. The system absorbed them without erasing them. The sixth angle was comparative power. For many German women, the most unsettling realization was not kindness, but scale. Supplies appeared abundant. Food quality was consistent. Medical equipment was modern and plentiful. Barracks were standardized. Repairs happened quickly. This was not improvisation. It was industrial reach. The camps reflected the same logistical capacity that had fueled American armies across 2 oceans. Even in confinement, the message was unmistakable. The United States could afford order. It could afford restraint. It could afford patience. That realization cut deeper than defeat on the battlefield, because it suggested that Germany had not simply lost a war. It had been outproduced, outorganized, and outsystemized. By the time this understanding settled, captivity no longer felt temporary. It felt structural, inevitable, governed not by vengeance, but by administration. And it was within that realization, quiet, bureaucratic, and irreversible that the true turning point began to take shape. When procedure replaced power, the turning point did not come with punishment. It came with normalization. By late April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the status of German female prisoners inside American camps quietly shifted from temporary custody to sustained containment. The war outside was still raging, but inside the wire, a different reality had settled in. Daily routines hardened into permanence. Morning roll call, breakfast distribution, assigned duties, medical inspections, evening head count. Lights out. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was precisely the shock. For many German women, captivity had been imagined as chaos, rage from victorious soldiers, humiliation, or neglect. Instead, it felt like being absorbed into a machine that did not care enough to hate them. This emotional absence was destabilizing. The moment crystallized most clearly during administrative processing. Women who had once held rank, nurses, auxiliaries, communication staff, were now asked to state their names, ages, training, and former duties. Not interrogated, not accused, recorded. American clerks typed steadily. Carbon paper slid between forms. Stamps struck dates and reference numbers. No questions about ideology. No lectures about guilt. Just documentation. For German prisoners, this created a profound internal rupture. The Third Reich had taught them that identity existed only within loyalty. Defeat meant erasure. Yet here they were, defeated, disarmed, and still acknowledged as individuals. Their rank no longer commanded authority, but it had not been stripped violently either. It had been rendered administratively irrelevant. That distinction mattered. In medical tents, American nurses treated German women with the same detached precision used for Allied wounded. Bandages were changed, infections monitored, recovery charts updated. Pain was addressed clinically, not morally. Some German women cried during treatment, not from pain but confusion. Others grew silent, withdrawing inward as the implications took hold. If the enemy neither punished nor celebrated their capture, what did surrender mean? If survival continued without ideology, what had ideology been for? The climax deepened as news filtered in. Rumors spread through the camp in fragments. Cities fallen, armies encircled, leaders gone silent, Berlin under siege. And still, the routine continued. American guards did not taunt. Medics did not rush. Officers did not raise their voices. The system functioned independently of emotion, as if the war had already been decided. This was the moment power fully inverted. German authority had relied on spectacle. Parades, uniforms, slogans, visible dominance. American authority relied on repetition, quiet enforcement, predictability. And predictability was inescapable. Female prisoners began to realize that there would be no dramatic reckoning, no final humiliation, no symbolic release. Their captivity would not climax. It would persist. That realization carried more psychological weight than any punishment, because it meant that the war was no longer something that could be endured until it ended. It had already ended inside the wire, and the consequences of that understanding were only beginning to unfold. The quiet moment of recognition, the decisive moment, did not come with an announcement. It arrived without ceremony during an ordinary inspection. In early May 1945, as Germany's collapse became undeniable, American POW camps transitioned from temporary holding areas into structured, long-term facilities. Orders came down not as speeches, but as updated forms, revised schedules, and new filing systems. For German female prisoners, this shift became visible in small, unsettling ways. Identification cards were reissued. Medical files expanded. Work rosters were standardized. Personal effects were cataloged, not discarded. Uniforms were no longer symbols of power, but neither were they torn away in anger. During one inspection, a U.S. officer paused over a roster, comparing handwritten entries to armbands and shoulder insignia. A German nurse stood rigid, waiting for reprimand. None came. The officer nodded, made a notation, and moved on. That was the moment it became undeniable. This was not temporary mercy. It was institutional policy. For women raised under a system where defeat meant annihilation of status, this realization struck with delayed force. The Americans were not improvising. They were executing a doctrine, one that separated control from cruelty, authority from emotion. Inside the camp, behavior began to change. German women adjusted their posture during roll call, not in defiance, but in adaptation. They followed schedules closely. They complied not out of fear, but out of recognition that resistance had no audience here. Some began assisting informally, organizing sleeping areas, helping distribute supplies, maintaining sanitation. These roles were not assigned with ceremony. They emerged because the system allowed structure to reappear, even among prisoners. This was the psychological turning point. The prisoners were no longer waiting for something worse to happen. They were confronting the reality that captivity itself was the end state. News of Germany's unconditional surrender arrived days later. But emotionally, the surrender had already occurred inside the wire. The war had ceased to be a struggle. It had become administration. For American personnel, none of this registered as significant. Guards rotated shifts. Medics filled charts. Officers filed reports. The machinery continued without pause, its power lying precisely in its indifference. For German women, however, this indifference was transformative. They had been taught to fear chaos at defeat. Instead, they encountered order without ideology. They had expected punishment. They received predictability. They had prepared for humiliation. They were met with neutrality. This contradiction forced an internal reckoning more severe than propaganda had prepared them for. If the enemy did not need to degrade them, then the moral framework they had lived within was incomplete. This moment, quiet, procedural, and almost invisible, was the true climax of their captivity. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was final. And as the camp settled into their post-war rhythm, the consequences of this realization would shape everything that followed. Life inside a system that did not collapse. After the psychological turning point passed, daily life inside American POW camps settled into a pattern that felt unsettling precisely because of its stability. By late May and June 1945, German female prisoners were no longer processed as a temporary wartime problem. They were managed as a population. Camps across the American zones of occupation, particularly in Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg, expanded administrative capacity rather than tightening discipline. Additional clerks were assigned. Medical stations grew more formal. Schedules were printed, posted, and enforced with consistency. For the prisoners, this continuity carried weight. Roll calls happened at the same hour each morning. Meals arrived on schedule. Work details rotated predictably. Medical checkups followed posted timetables. Infractions were documented, not shouted about. Consequences were written down, explained, and applied uniformly. This predictability altered behavior more effectively than intimidation ever could. German women who had arrived braced for volatility gradually adjusted to routine. Sleep patterns stabilized. Conversations grew quieter, more practical. Emotional outbursts diminished, replaced by controlled detachment. Survival was no longer an act of defiance. It was an administrative outcome. The absence of ideological pressure was particularly striking. American guards did not lecture prisoners about Nazism. Re-education would come later, through structured programs and civilian authorities. Inside the camps, the mission was simpler: maintain order, prevent unrest, preserve health. For women who had lived under constant ideological reinforcement, this silence was disorienting. There were no slogans, no chants, no forced declarations of loyalty or shame. Instead, there were forms. Rank continued to exist in records long after it ceased to matter militarily. Nurses were listed as nurses, clerks as clerks, civil auxiliaries as auxiliaries. The information was preserved because the system demanded completeness, not because it sought validation. Over time, this documentation reshaped internal dynamics among the prisoners themselves. Women who had once held responsibility, medical supervisors, senior clerks, found that their experience still carried practical value. American administrators occasionally asked for assistance translating medical terms, organizing infirmaries, or explaining pre-war procedures. These requests were framed as logistical needs, not privileges. Participation was voluntary, but many accepted, not because they felt loyal to their captors, but because structure gave them purpose. This created a subtle psychological shift. Identity, once tied entirely to victory or defeat, began to separate from the outcome of the war itself. A nurse could still be a nurse, even if the Reich had fallen. A clerk could still organize records, even in captivity. This realization did not bring relief. It brought complexity. Shame did not vanish, nor did grief. Many women still mourned lost families, destroyed cities, and the collapse of the world they had known. But that mourning now existed alongside routine, rather than replacing it. American reports from the period reflect this transition clearly. Camp commanders noted decreasing incidents of defiance and self-harm among female prisoners compared to earlier months. Cooperation increased. Sanitation improved. Medical outcomes stabilized. From a military standpoint, the system worked. From a human standpoint, it left deeper questions unresolved. And as summer advanced and post-war planning intensified, the American administration would begin shifting from containment to transition, raising a new uncertainty for the prisoners inside the wire. Transition from captivity to post-war reality. By mid-1945, the Allied victory in Europe was certain. The surrender of Germany on May 8th had removed the immediate threat of combat, but the POW camps still held thousands of German women. For these prisoners, the wire no longer separated combatants from the defeated. It separated them from a future that had not yet begun. American officers understood that orderly administration now had a dual purpose: security and preparation for reintegration. Daily life was predictable, yet the looming questions of repatriation, reeducation, and social reconstruction created a pervasive tension. Camps became microcosms of post-war transition, where the routines of the present existed alongside the uncertainties of tomorrow. Medical care continued uninterrupted. Nurses and other medical personnel were recorded, observed, and occasionally asked to assist in practical tasks, sorting medications, maintaining hygiene, or helping with minor triage for newly arrived prisoners. These assignments were framed strictly as administrative necessities. Yet for the women, being recognized for their professional expertise, even under enemy supervision, was profoundly disorienting. It forced them to confront a new reality. Competence and identity could survive the collapse of an entire regime. Interaction with American personnel remained formal and disciplined. Guards and medics spoke minimally, following procedure. Small courtesies, clean bedding, consistent meals, access to hygiene, were administered with precision, not generosity. Letters were delivered according to schedule. Clothing and personal items were maintained according to inventory. Rank was never questioned, insignia never removed. In this environment, the prisoners began to measure the world not by ideology, but by the consistency of the system around them. Psychologically, the effect was subtle but cumulative. Many women described the initial dissonance. Expecting humiliation, chaos, or arbitrary punishment, they instead encountered structured neutrality. Over weeks, this predictability produced compliance, reduced anxiety, and even tentative cooperation. Some senior nurses discreetly assumed minor leadership roles within the prisoner population, organizing sanitation, ration distribution, or educational opportunities. Authority, once tied entirely to wartime hierarchy, became operational rather than ceremonial. Repatriation planning added a further layer of uncertainty. The Americans communicated schedules, forms, and transport arrangements, but often these were delayed by logistical challenges, particularly as the European theater demanded coordination with military and civilian authorities. Prisoners waited in structured routines while anticipating the unknown. 4 German women, trained in obedience and loyalty, this waiting tested endurance in a manner different from battlefield stress. It was a slow confrontation with the collapse of control itself. Reports from Allied officers noted another key outcome: behavioral shifts among the prisoners. Women who had previously resisted orders or displayed emotional volatility became more measured in their interactions. Conflict within the camps decreased. Work details ran smoothly. Medical outcomes improved. The camp system, designed for efficiency, had achieved a secondary objective: establishing order without coercion, reinforcing the concept that structure and authority could exist independently of ideology. By late summer 1945, the camps were operating as transitional institutions. German women prisoners had survived not only because of American logistical and medical efficiency, but because the system respected, at least administratively, their skills, identity, and roles. The war had ended, yet its human consequences continued to unfold, structured, disciplined, and profoundly challenging for those who had known only the collapse of a world defined by obedience, hierarchy, and ideology. This period marked a critical intersection between military procedure and human psychology. For the prisoners, the acknowledgement of rank, the neutrality of treatment, and the procedural consistency of American authority created a new lens through which to understand defeat, survival, and identity. And for the American forces, it reinforced a strategic principle: order, documentation, and ethical procedure were as powerful tools as any weapon on the battlefield. The story of German female prisoners in American POW camps offers more than a glimpse into wartime captivity. It reveals the quiet power of order, procedure, and ethical discipline. These women, trained in loyalty, obedience, and hierarchy, faced a world turned upside down. Their expectations of humiliation, chaos, and degradation were repeatedly contradicted by a system that recognized identity without allegiance, authority without coercion, and survival without ceremony. This contrast between wartime indoctrination and post-capture reality underscores a profound truth. Structure and discipline, when applied consistently and humanely, can shape behavior as effectively as any military operation. The Americans demonstrated that control need not rely on fear, cruelty, or improvisation. Instead, meticulous documentation, adherence to procedure, and the acknowledgement of professional rank transformed what could have been psychological torment into an environment of measured order. For the prisoners, these small acts, insignia preserved, roles acknowledged, routines maintained, became markers of humanity amidst defeat. Survival carried not just the weight of existence, but the validation of competence and identity. Even in the absence of ideology, these women found themselves recognized as professionals, not merely as remnants of a vanquished army. The effect lingered long after repatriation, shaping memories of the war and reframing what it meant to be a captive. From a broader historical perspective, the handling of female POWs reflected the strategic maturity of the United States in 1945. Military success was no longer measured solely by weapons, tactics, or territory, but by the ability to manage complex human realities with precision and fairness. The meticulous administration of POW camps, often overlooked in battlefield histories, emerged as a tool of psychological influence, operational efficiency, and moral authority. In the end, these camps were a microcosm of post-war transformation, a space where defeat met order, fear met discipline, and obedience met empathy. They illustrate the quiet but profound ways in which structured human systems can preserve dignity, maintain security, and reshape perceptions, even amidst the lingering shadows of war. For the women who endured them and for the officers who administered them, the legacy was clear. The end of conflict did not simply erase the past, but revealed how humanity could persist, even within the machinery of military victory.